This is Gemara Rosh HaShanah Daf Beis, a new Masechta, all the learning for today. As the week of Shabbat Brachas continues, has been dedicated as a schos for the Chassan in college. It's Yibolig and Debbie Carniel and Mirz Hashem. They should continue building Abayis Naman Be Yisrael. The schos of the entire Chabura learning should be a tremendous schos. They should start off their marriage on the right foot. Of course, we can't forget the schos Shidduch V'Sochaim the Virgin Miriam B'Tzviyid the Gittul Shal Esta B'Shana Makal Yom Mordechai B'Stav V'Shindol as a Gittul B'Stav V'Shindol. As well as schos for Hashem Shamiyos Men Veda and Men V'Chaim B'Sar Shamsin Reiz L'Sar B'Skanandi the Basim As Chayisai Yisol B'Mendel as the Shomas Nami, which Avik Shechanish Mobatila Din Khanrezel, Mulkhay Vasmin Librachas and Musa Dinero Mindas View Figure Nicholas Son is the Hoover for Goshem Del Sumich Lester. Besoik Shar, Chayla Yisrael, and Umisachta. We welcome all the new subscribers, all the new listeners, and I guess we begin with a bracha, as always, with the same geshmak and fire and clarity that we want right now. We should continue for the whole Masechta, and hopefully it should fuel us as we march towards the end of Ma'id. And someone gave me a nice tip. All the YouTube subscribers out there, you should click notifications on. I don't know exactly what that means, but I believe what that means is that when the share goes up, you will get a pop-up telling you the share is there. Again, as always, we're trying to get the share up at least a day or two earlier for everyone who wants to prepare, everyone wants to chazer, etc., etc. Now, with all the wonderful announcements, let's get learning. Says the Mishnah, Arba, Rosh HaShanah Heim. There are 4 Rosh HaShanahs. There are 4 times of the year that there are Rosh HaShanah that are the beginning of sorts. What are these 4 times? Says the Mishnah. Becha b'Nisan. The first one is on the first of Nisan is Rosh HaShanah l'Melachim, is Rosh HaShanah for kings, Ula Regalim, and that's what begins the Regalim, the Shalosh Regalim. And of course, the Gemara is going to explain exactly what does it mean. It's Rosh HaShanah for Melachim, Regalim, etc., etc. And actually, we'll take one moment before we even get into it, and Rashi already points out, Rashi already gives us a little bit of a secret, that what does it mean it's Rosh HaShanah for Malachim, for kings? So Rashi tells us 2 lines for the top, it's for Shtarei Seyam, that when they would write a shtar, when they would write a document, they would write the shtar for the years of the king, and therefore they would have to know when was the king's reign begin, when did it end? And if there wasn't a set date, and it was more arbitrary, as we'll see in the Gemara in a few moments, we're afraid that one's going to come to mess up, and have a predated shtar, a post-dated shtar document, and we'll explain that in the Gemara in a few moments. So the Mishnah continues that the first of Nisan is the new year's for Malachim, for kings, Regalim, and for the festivals. Bechad Be'el, the first of Elul, is Rosh HaShanah Meiser Behema. That's for Meiser Behema. And Rashi points out, what does that mean? That you can't take Meiser off of an animal that's born in this year for an animal that's born in that year. So what does it mean this year and that year? That is defined by the first of Elul. So if an animal is born the day before Elul, and the animal is born 2 days later, that's considered 2 different years, and you cannot take Meiser from one animal to the next. Rav Elazar, Rav Shimon, no, Bechad B'Tishrei. They argue and they say, when is Meiser? When does the Meiser Behema? When's the new year? When's that cutoff point? It's not the first of Elul, but rather the first of Tishrei. The Mishnah continues, what's the third Rosh HaShanah? Becha B'Tishrei is Rosh HaShanah L'Shanim, as we of course know, which is the Rosh HaShanah for a new year. Ule Shmitin, and for Shemitah, which for us here in Eretz Yisrael has been very, very relevant. They're ready with the first of Tishrei, the first of Rosh HaShanah. All the halachas of Shemitah came into effect. As Rashi points out, you can't plow, you can't sow, you can't work the field at all. And as well, that's when the crops begin to have the Kedusha of Shemitah, depending on fruits and vegetables, etc. Ule Yovel is similar for Yovel and Atiyah for planting, the yarkos for vegetables. What does it mean, Lenatiyah? Rashi points out that means for the Arla. Arla, the crop you can't eat for the first few years. When does that begin? That begins with Tishrei. Now, the fourth Rosh HaShanah, Bechad Shvat, is Rosh HaShanah Le'ilam, Kedivri Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says, when is Rosh HaShanah for the new year? For the trees, is the first of Shvat, which of course we know, what do we hold? 2 B'Shvat. Beis Hillel Imrim B'Chamisha Asar Bai on 2 B'Shvat. Those are the 4 Rosh Hashanahs, the 4 times of the new year, which are going to have many, many ramifications throughout the halacha, as the Gemara is going to explain. So the first we had is kings, and Regalim is the first of Nisan. The first of Elul is for Meiser Behema, whereas some say that's on Tishrei. The first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah of the New Year, Shemitah, Yovel, Natiyah, Yerakos, etc. And the first of Shvat is a Machlokes. Beis Shammai says that's Rosh Hashanah Le'ilanis. And of course, we know 2 B'Shvat is on the 15th of Shvat. We begin the Gemara, the first case in the Mishnah. What was the first Rosh Hashanah, the first of Nisan? We said in the Mishnah was Rosh Hashanah for Malachim, for kings. Rashi already gave us a bit of a clue. Rashi taught us that what does it mean for kings? It meant for the shtaros, it meant for the documents. But ask the Gemara, Lamai Hilchasa, for what reason do we need to have a standardized date for when each king comes to reign, and Rashi right away, Rashi says Kloimar, which we know, Kloimar meaning, Rashi's pointing out that the words Lamai Hilchas over here don't just mean what is the halacha. Rashi says Kloimar, Lama Hokfu Yom Yuchad Leminyan Amlachim. Why do we have to set a specified day for the date of the kings? Ema Shal Kol Melech Umelech Masl Shanasam Yom Shamed Bay. Why don't we just say that each and every king will begin his reign from whatever day he takes over? One king will be in January, one will be February, one will be March. What's the difference? Whenever the king comes to reign, that's when his year begins. Why do we need to have a set month? And this month, a new reign is going to begin. And of course, what that means is that when it comes Nisan, this second year begins. Meaning, if one king started his reign in Adar, and then the next month, Nisan, it's called the second year of that reign. So if you'd be writing a star in that Nisan, you would write that whatever the date is of the king on the second year of his reign. Second year, he's only been servicing for 2 months. Correct, because Nisan begins a new year. So says the Gemara, why do we need that? Lamai Hilchasa. Amar Rav Chisda points out, like Rashi already started to teach us Lishtaros, that what? If you have a predated star, it's possible. A post-dated star is kosher. So first let's explain the concept that we'll see what it has to do with us. Whenever we have a star, a document that someone owes someone money, if it's a document if there's a loan or something that's recorded in a document, the halacha is not only can you collect the cash that was borrowed, but you also collect mishubadim, you collect properties. There's a lien that is created. If I borrow from you, let's say $1 million, now you have a lien on $1 million on my properties. Now which properties? Only the properties that I have at the time of the loan, and therefore, if I borrow from you on January 1st $1 million, and on February 1st, I go and I sell a house for $500,000. And then on March 1st, you come to me to collect the loan. I say, I'm sorry, I don't have it. You're allowed to go to that person who bought my house, that $500,000 house, and say, it's mine. I have a lien on that property. And of course, that is how all basic liens work. But now it's only going to be items that were sold after the shtar was written. If I sold something today, and then tomorrow I borrow money from you, the fact that I sold the property today is irrelevant to you, because that's prior. Now, so what happens that sometimes Rashi points out, and everything we're talking about is in this long and lengthy Rashi, Rashi points out that what happens is that someone, the loiva, the borrower, might come and say, I want you to write me a shtar that I owe someone money. And of course, Adim, the witnesses are allowed to write such because he's the borrower, he's not the lender. So he's like, you're allowed to obligate yourself something. And you write that you borrow it, that you owe someone money. And then at a later date, you actually borrow the money. But we don't then remember 5 years later when someone comes to collect, we don't remember, wait, was that before or after? Meaning, because if there's no standardized times of dates, what's going to happen? We're just going to see a month. We're going to see that one thing happened in January, one thing happened in March. March could be after January, or March could be the next year. And we don't know, did it happen pre or did it happen post? And therefore, because of that issue, they had to set a standardized date. Let's take one moment to see a little bit of a Rashi together. Rashi says, V'mloi kava yoyim, we're in that long Rashi. We're 4 lines into the Rashi. Rashi says, you will not be able to differentiate. You'll never know. If there's no standardized dates, you won't remember, and you won't be able to know if a document is predated or postdated. Keep going. And Rashi plays out the case like we just said. And on Kislev in the 3rd year, Reuven borrowed $100. And the Eidim said, when we signed that document, we didn't actually see the loan happen. Ella, the borrower came to us and said, it's time for us, please, that I owe him money. And like we learned in Baba Basra, that you're allowed to do that even though the Malva's not there. And the Eidim say, we don't know. And we don't know when did the actual halva happen. Meaning, we don't know, did Reuven come to Eidim and say, please write, I owe Shimon $100 because I yesterday borrowed from him? Or because I'm going to borrow him and you're in front of me now, I want you to write the document right now. Avo, what do we see? We see in a document that you borrowed on Tammuz on the 30th year, Lamelech plenty for such and such king. And let's say the Dayanim don't know when did that king take reign. You won't be able to differentiate. Im Tammuz koidim lekislev, Im Kislev koidim leTammuz. Because of course, Tammuz is the summer, Kislev is the winter. So let's just use summer and the winter. So right now we're going to the summer, we're going to the winter. So this winter is after the past summer, and it's before the next summer. And if we don't know years, so you don't know, if we're just sitting here and we just see a document and we just know something, we don't know was it pre or was it post. We don't know if the king took reign between Tammuz and Kislev, Nimsa Kislev, koidim leTammuz, and then it's beforehand, and then it's an early star, and if it's an early star, it's possible, because you can't collect with it, or if you came to reign afterwards, and therefore everything's going to be fine. So because of that reason, and again, let's point out those words that Rashi says, the Dayanim don't remember when the king took reign, therefore we make a standardized time, and therefore whenever we're going to see in a document, and we're going to see that it says the third year, the fourth year, etc., we're always going to know, because Nisan is when the calendar year is going to flip. I'll just point out the obvious question I'm sure many people are bothered by, which really Taisus here takes issue with, that what does that mean? We're not going to remember when the king took reign. That's a pretty funny thing. It's our king taking over. It's quite a big event. How do we not remember when that happened? And that's Taisus' issue, and therefore he has a noob shot. But that's the first thing in the Mishnah, that we have to have a set date when the king's years switch, so that we never have an issue with pre or post-dated shtaris. Taner Rabbanan says, the Gemara, Melech Shamar B'Esim V'Tisha B'Adar, if a king took reign on the 29th of Adar, when the first of Nisan comes, also Rosh HaShanah, it's considered his year is complete, and then the next day it's his second year of his reign. But if he only started reign on the first of Nisan, it's not considered a year until the next Nisan comes. Very simple. Nisan is when the year flips. If you start a day before, then on Nisan it's the second year. If you start a day after, you have to wait till the next Nisan. Amar Mar, says the Gemara, let's dissect that brisa. A king came to reign on the 29th of Adar. So what did you tell me? That when the first of Nisan comes, the year is complete, and now it's his second year. As we turn over to Beis Amid Beis, what does that teach us? What is the first din in the brisa teaching us? Very good, like our Mishnah said. Nisan is the New Year's for the king. Very good. And it's also teaching me a chiddush that 1 year could be a year. That if you start reign on the 29th, on the 1st it's a new year. Beautiful. But the Brisa continued, and the Brisa said a second case. If you only come to reign on the first of Nisan, we don't consider it a year until the next Nisan. Says Pshita, what's that teaching me? That's exact same application, just with new dates. Of course, that's obvious. We already knew that. Answers the Gemara again. Let's just appreciate the question. The Brisa taught me that if you start on the 29th, on the 1st, it's a new year. Which teaches me that 1 year is considered a year, and teaches me that when the Nisan comes, it's a new year. Great. So then it says, but if you start your reign on the 1st of Nisan, it's not a new year to the next year. Obvious, that's the most pasha thing in the world. We already know that. Answers the Gemara 4 lines down. The case is where they voted him in. The council, the sages decided he should be king already in Adar. So meaning a month earlier. So no. I would think that the voting him in, maybe that's when his reign begins, and not when he actually practically takes over. Kamash Malan says the Brisa, no, it goes when he practically becomes king, and the fact that they voted him in early, that is irrelevant to us. Tanarab on a new Brisa, 5 lines from the top. If the king dies in Adar and a new king comes into reign in Adar, then you're allowed to write the year for either one, because that year the king was in reign, and the new king is in reign for that year as well. Meis ben Nisan. Let's say the king dies in Nisan. Again, it's in the same year. Everything is very simple. But Meis ba'adar b'Nisan. Let's say the king dies in Adar, and we don't get a chance to appoint a new king until Nisan. Says the Brisa. So then, what do we have to do? We count the first year for the first king, because he was the only one in reign that year. Ushniya l'sheni. money, and the next year, if you have a halva, if you have a loan in the next year, you're not allowed to date it with the previous king, because the previous king is no longer around, and you can't write it's the next year of the previous king's reign, because he's dead. Therefore, what do you have to do? You write for the new king. So very simple, 3 different cases in the Brisa. The Brisa is teaching me that if everyone dies and takes reign in the same month, whether it's Adar, whether it's Nisan, they're both considered kings in that year. Whereas if it flips with Nisan, then it's a new reign, a new year, etc., etc. So Amar, let's dissect this Brisa, these 3 cases. We count the year for this one and I count the year for that one. Pshita. Of course, again, what's the chiddush that is teaching me? I would have thought maybe you're not able to count 1 year for 2 different kings. Maybe it's an impossibility. Each year gets 1 king, and the fact that a second king took over in the same year, maybe we're not allowed to use his name until the new year begins, because the old king was in reign this year. Kamash Mala, no. They're allowed to do either one, because they both were reigning, they both were kings during the same year. Next case in the Brisa. If the king dies and a new king comes into reign in Nisan, again, Pshita, it's mamish, the exact same as the previous case. Says the Gemara. I would think, when do we say the rule that 1 day is considered a year is B'soiv Shana? Maybe that's only at the end of the year. Maybe if someone becomes king on the 29th of Adar, and then on the 1st of Nisan, is his new year, because maybe at the end of a year, that's called a year. However, but if it's at the beginning of the year, lo yamrinan, maybe not. So maybe the fact that he became into reign right now on the 1st of Nisan, maybe 1 day king is not enough to call him a king, and therefore we can't date a star with his name. Kamash Blan, that even 1 date is enough. And that's the second case of the Brisa. And again, we'll just point out that the top thesis over here points out what's the svara? We sort of set it over as if it's a rule. What's the svara? Asks Taisus that the first day of the year should be any different than the last day of the year. Taisus says it should be a kal v'chaymer. He asks questions from the Gemara and Ida, etc., etc. Back into the Gemara. What was the third case of the Brisa? Meis ba'adar v'manachadachto b'Nisan. If one king dies in Adar and the next king takes over Nisan, manam rishon l'rishon u'shniya l'shniya. So it's when we said that each king has its own year. The first one is for the first king, and the second one is for the second king. Again, the Gemara has the exact same question. Pshita, these are all the same applications of the fact that Nisan is a new calendar year. Why do we have to keep on explaining the same din again and again? Explains the Gemara, you know what the novelty, the chiddush is? Is that they voted him in on Adar, which again, we also know that. So that itself is not enough. Umelech ben melechu. And he's the king, the son of a king, that he became a king because his father was a king. As Rashi points out, that the kingdom is a Yerusha, as the pasuk says, so therefore you would think he has 2 things going for him. Number 1, he was voted in early. Number 2, his father was the king. So it was known, it was implied he was king. So I would have thought maybe he should be allowed to be considered 2 years when Nisan becomes. Kamashmala, no, he only took reign in Nisan, he only begins in Nisan. And that's the first part of today's Gemara, or I should say really the second part of today's Gemara. The first part of the Gemara was discussing that we start the king's year from Nisan. Why do we need a set date? We said because of shtarais, because we have to know a set date in order to have the validity of a shtar in case the Bezdin will forget when the king came to reign. We need to know, is the shtar early, is the shtar late? Can you use the shtar to collect? And then number 2, we just went through and we played out 2 different Brises, 2 cases in Brisa number 1, 3 cases in Brisa number 2. All the different permutations of a king dying in Adar, taking over in Adar, dying in Nisan, taking over in Nisan, dying in Adar, taking over in Nisan. The different chedushim that voting him in is not enough. Voting him in, even if he's the son of a king, is not enough. And that is part number 1 of the Mishnah. And now we continue, and we want to know, fine, we took it for granted that it started with Nisan. How do we know that? Where did you get this from? You taught me now why we need the whole din. Very good. You explained, you convinced me that we need the din. Why do we need the din for shtaris, etc.? But how do you know it starts with Nisan? Asks Rabbi Yochanan. And this is a question that's going to take us all the way through tomorrow's daf. Says the Gemara, Shenemar, you know what the Makar is? It says in the Torah, and it was the 480th year from when Klal Yisrael left Mitzrayim, Bishana Haravias, in the 4th year, B'chaydesh Ziv, in the month of Ziv, which is what? Chaydesh Hasheni, which is the 2nd month, L'melech Shleimai al Yisrael to Shlomo Melech's reign on Klal Yisrael. And I said a pasuk in the Torah. Of course, this is a pasuk in Malachim. So the pasuk is telling that it was the 480th year when Klal Yisrael went out of Mitzrayim, and the second month when Shlomo was reigning over Klal Yisrael. So in this pasuk, there are two ideas that are juxtaposed, which is a classical hekesh. We have a Yitzias Mitzrayim and the kingdom of Shlomo HaMelech. Says the Gemara, Makish Malchus Shlomo Yitzias Mitzrayim. We see the kingdom of Shlomo is put next to, juxtaposed as a hekish to the leaving of Mitzrayim. Ma Yitzias Mitzrayim in Nisan. Just like we know we left Yitzias Mitzrayim from Nisan, we left Egypt on Nisan. Av Malchus Shlomo min Nisan. So too we count the kingdom from Nisan. So source number one says Rav Yochanan is how do we know we count kings from Nisan? From the fact the pasuk in Malachim has a hekish and puts together the kingdom of Shlomo next to Yitzias Mitzrayim, source number one. Tomorrow we'll have source number two. But within this source, it was assumed that when was Yitzias Mitzrayim? Nisan. Now the Gemara asks, Yitzias Mitzrayim guva minal and minyanan. How do you know that Yitzias Mitzrayim was from Nisan? Again, not that it happened then. How do you know that we count the date from Nisan? And that any time that we're going to say this is such and such time, from the time he left in Egypt, it goes back and starts from Nisan. Telma asked the Gemara, Mi Tishrei minyanan. Maybe we count from Tishrei. Again, we're asking, how do we know that the Rosh HaShanah with regard to Yitzias Mitzrayim, that we know we went out of Egypt, and then we know whenever Nisan is going to come, it's the second year from leaving Egypt. Whenever Nisan is going to come, it's the third year from leaving Mitzrayim. How do we know that? Maybe we should count from Tishrei. Says the Gemara, Lo Salkadaitach. Don't entertain such a possibility. The Torah says, Aaron Kohen went up to Har, Al Panei Hashem, Al Pi Hashem, through the word of Hashem. Vayama Sham, and Aaron dies. The 40th year from Klal Yisrael leaving Mitzrayim, Aaron HaKohen is nifter. Pasuk number one. When was this? The first of the month of the 5th month, which we'll see what that means. Uksiv. And there's a second pasuk. Now Moshe Rabbeinu is talking. Moshe Rabbeinu is talking in Devarim and says Moshe Rabbeinu, Vahi b'arba'im shana b'ashtei yasei chodesh b'echad lachodesh diber Moshe. And it was, says the Torah, and it was in the 40th year in the 11th month, Moshe Rabbeinu spoke. Says the Gemara, Midekoi ba'av, it was at Av v'kar leishnas arba'im, when the first pasuk by Aaron HaKohen said the 5th month, Nisan Iyar Sivan Tammuz Av, it's in the 5th month and it calls it the 40th year. V'koi b'shvat, Nisan Iyar Sivan Tammuz Av, El Tishrei Cheshvan Kislev Teves Shvat, and we get to Shvat v'kar leishnas arba'im, and it's still the 40th year. Mechlad Rosh HaShanah lav Tishrei hu. We see Rosh HaShanah can't be Tishrei. Again, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av, El Tishrei. If Tishrei was when the new year begins for Yitzias Mitzrayim, when we get the Shvat, it should be the 41st year. From the fact that we see that it's still considered the 40th year, must be Tishrei is not when the calendar switches with regard to Yitzias Mitzrayim. Says the Gemara, I understand that the first pasuk is going by Aaron HaKohen. It says the 40th year when they left Mitzrayim. Elahai, the second pasuk by Moshe Rabbeinu talking, Mitzrayim don't lie comes on Mishkan. How do we know when the pasuk says it was 40 years on the 11th month Moshe spoke? How do you know it was 40 years from Yitzias Mitzrayim? Maybe it was 40 years from when the Mishkan was set up. Answers the Gemara, Shanas Esrim, the Gzeir Shava. It says the word Shanas Esrim, Hachanami, that's what Papa says, So by us, Hachanami, Shanas Arba'im, the Gzeir Shava, both Psukim said, Arba'im Shana, and they both use the same word, Arba'im Shana, shows us it's referring to the same reference point in time, Yitzias Mitzrayim. Makan Yitzias Mitzrayim, Afkan Yitzias Mitzrayim. Therefore, we know they're both referring to Yitzias Mitzrayim. We're going to go for one more moment. We really could stop here, but let's go one moment to really wrap up this whole discussion. Ask the Gemara, how do you know that first Aaron HaKohen died in Av? Maybe first Moshe Rabbeinu spoke in Shvat. Again, the same idea. Whenever you have a calendar year, Nisan year, Sivan Tammuz Av, Elul Tishrei Cheshvan Kislev Teves Shvat. Shvat could be before Av or after Av. We don't know which is first. Says the Gemara, Gemara, no, it has to be that Aaron died first, that Av came first, Shvat came second, and therefore Tishrei can't be the Rosh Hashanah. Lo Sagadaitach. Why? It says in the Torah, after Sichon was destroyed. And when Aaron died, Sichon is still alive. When Moshe Rabbeinu spoke, it says after Sichon is destroyed. And when Aaron died, Sichon is alive. So it must be Aaron died, then Sichon was destroyed, and then Moshe Rabbeinu spoke. So we knew that Aaron HaKohen's story must have been first. T'chsev, as the Torah says, moving over to Gimel Amud Aleph, tomorrow's daf, and we'll conclude with this. V'yishma Kanani melech Arad, and the Kanani heard the king of Arad. Ma Shmua Shama, what did the Kanani, the king of Arad, hear? Shama Shemes Aaron, he heard that Aaron died, in Nistalku Anani Akavoid, and the clouds of glory left Klal Yisrael. V'katsaver, and he thought this referring to Sichon, Nidna Rishos Lachem B'Yisrael, he could wage war with Klal Yisrael. And that's what the pasuk says. V'yiru kol Eida, and the entire congregation saw Kigava Aaron, that Aaron had died. V'amar Rav Avuah Tikri V'yiru doesn't mean that the congregation saw that Aaron had died. Elavayirau rather means they were made to be seen that Aaron HaKohen died. And therefore says the Gemara, that's how we know that Sichon heard that Aaron died. Then Sichon attacked, and then Moshe Rabbeinu spoke. So must mean first was the death of Aaron, then was the attack of Sichon, then was the speech of Moshe Rabbeinu. So Av was before Shvat, proving Tishrei can't be Rosh Hashanah for the king. And the Gemara concludes, Midami Asam Canaan Sichon, Tanu Sichon who Arad, Canaan was all the same person. Sichon Shadaim Lesayach, Bamidbar Canaan Al Shem Alchusay Ma Shemai, Arad Shemai. This last little piece we'll run through at the beginning of tomorrow's shir. We'll pick up tomorrow, Mir Hashem.